Don't forget to subscribe and click the bell button to be notified about new videos. The sprint planning meeting is a crucial ceremony in Scrum. The aim of the sprint planning meeting is to identify the following: which stories will move from the product backlog and into the sprint backlog, define the sprint boundaries, and agree on the goal of the sprint. In this video, I'm covering two methods for defining how much work is moved from the product backlog and into your sprint backlog. Those two methods are yesterday's weather and fill the bucket. So before I go into yesterday's weather, let me give you some weird background on this. So as the story goes, and you can Google it because I don't know how accurate this is, if a weather forecaster were to use yesterday's weather forecast today, he would be correct 70% of the time. So I'm told. So the story goes. So that's where this approach is derived from. But it's basically a simple approach to forecast the Scrum team's capacity for the sprint. And remember, the sprint planning session takes place on day one of the sprint. You can check this with the Scrum Alliance, PMI. Sprint planning session is day one of the sprint. So anyway, back to yesterday's weather. This approach assumes that this sprint is the same as the previous sprint. So for example, if your velocity for the previous sprint was 80 points, then you should assign 80 points worth of stories for this sprint. It's pretty straightforward. Now, if your points don't exactly add up to 80, then you put in fewer, not more. So let's say you're at 76 points in your sprint backlog, but the remaining PBI's product backlog items are 5-point stories, which would put you at 81. Don't bring those over, leave them. It's always best practice to underpromise and overdeliver. Now, some of the pros of this approach: it's very easy to remember and is very straightforward. However, there are some cons to this approach. So, if you have abnormal or irregular sprints, such as resources not committing to the same number of hours, then your forecast will be off for the next sprint if you try and use this approach. So let's say your team is committed 200 hours for the previous sprint, but they can't commit 200 hours to this sprint. In fact, if your team commits anything other than 200 hours, so if they commit 210 or 180, that's not going to work. You can't use yesterday's weather for this approach for the obvious reason of the number of working hours being different. So this really impacts non-dedicated teams. This is typically where you need to know how many hours you have. But in short, the conditions of each sprint must be identical in order to adopt the yesterday's weather approach. Now, fill the bucket. This is probably the approach that you're already using, you just didn't realize it had a name. This method is different in that it doesn't consider the previous velocity when deciding how many points to put into the sprint backlog. The team simply looks at the product backlog, or PBIs, and starts moving them off into the current sprint backlog. Each time you bring a story over, you break it down into tasks, and the team considers and discusses whether the bucket is full, or if the team could realistically take on more scope. And as you get more and more stories into the sprint backlog, at some point eventually the team should agree that no more scope should be added. Meeting's done. Well, meeting's not done, but the sprint backlog is complete, and this is what we're going to work with. So the pros of this approach are: the team isn't obligated to follow any particular velocity guidelines, and the team has more flexibility in that, you can evaluate your current situation when deciding on the sprint scope. So you might want to pull in fewer stories because there's people on holiday or on vacation, or you may want to pull in more work because you've got everybody there and just a ton. Everyone's committed a ton of hours to this sprint. So, or maybe some blockers have been removed. Anything that might give you more flexibility to bring in more work. The cons of this approach, let me think. To be honest, I can't think of any disadvantages to this approach. So if you're thinking, all right, Mark, hey, that's great information, which method is best for us? It's hard to say, to be honest, especially since I don't know who us is. I would recommend that you start with both methods. start with yesterday's weather, look at your last sprint's velocity, and discuss with the team whether or not this is a realistic amount to use again. Then just start pulling in your stories into the sprint backlog until you feel that the bucket is full. This will allow you to adjust based on other factors, specific to the sprint. So that's pretty much it. I know I always say that's pretty much it, but yeah, that's pretty much it. So if you weren't familiar with these two methods, now you know. You can do some Googling. If you were, hey, thanks for watching this video anyway. And that's it. I hope you found some value in this video, and look forward to the next video. Oh, and check out my video on my Scrum board and how to use it. I'm actually working on making one that looks a lot better. If you've purchased that one, you'll get this one for free. Aside from that, again, I will catch you in the next video. Thanks.